Keeping up on Seattle area politics is tough. Who has time to sit through a 3-hour council meeting and sort out which decisions will affect you most?
Please vote aye.
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 Well, what if getting caught up on current events was as simple as getting a cup of coffee with some City Hall insiders who know which stories are hot and which are not? Welcome to Seattle News, Views, and Brews. And here we go with Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where big stories are always percolating. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views here expressed are my own. Now, normally, we're joined by Seattle City Council Insights Kevin Schofield. He's not able to join me this week, so pinch hitting. David Kroman, the city reporter from Crosscut. David, good to have you.
Good to be here.
Also, a big thanks, of course, to City Grind Espresso. As always, the owners, John and Charlie, thank you so much. You know them as the coffee cart on the first floor of City Hall. They have the hallowed position as our background noise sponsor. Always good to hear them. All right, so let's go right here, right now. David, I want to start talking about public safety because we had a series of shootings in Seattle over the mid to end of January period here. The council, I know, is going to be looking at this closely over the next few weeks. You, just before we're taping this podcast here, were talking with some of the different public officials involved, the mayor, the chief of police. What's going on here? I think there's a new focus on public safety after what was a horrifying string of events.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mayor and the city council and the police chief are going to be under a lot of pressure to respond to the shooting that occurred, which was horrific. Mm-hmm. And you know, the question will be sort of what can they do that they are not already trying to do, because specifically in this area, the city council budgeted enough for them to do emphasis patrols in this area. So and they have been doing them pretty consistently for pretty much 6 months at this point. And so there's already an increased police presence in that neighborhood.
Right.
So,
we're talking about the Westlake area here.
Right. In the Westlake downtown corridor area.
Yeah.
And so
the Blade, as some people call it.
Yeah, right. And so, you know, they pointed out that because of that, the police were very quick to respond to the shooting. I think the first officer was there in 15 seconds.
I heard that too.
But because they're going to have to do something, it'll be interesting to see how do you put more emphasis on an area that already is being emphasized. The mayor today talked a lot about sort of more diversion programs and outreach to youth, because they're connecting this to some gang violence in the city.
There are some suspects in custody, which is a good sign here.
Right. But I think also what we'll see is probably, you know, I know that there's been a lot of undercover work happening in that area. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if they sort of maybe dial back on the undercover work and put more officers in uniform just as a sort of visible symbol. And then they're also going to put a mobile precinct there, so a van that the officers can work out of.
Right.
So, you know, it'll be interesting. I think there will be a debate around whether or not that is going to be effective or it's going to be enough, but I think that is what we're going to see.
It's a start, and when you talk about 3 shootings basically in downtown Seattle over the span of 24 hours, I know that in recent years, Seattle has seen it such that those type of shooting statistics have actually gone down. When something like this happens in so many shootings in such a close proximity to each other in terms of distance and time, I think people get a little worried about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And the mayor referred to the fact that sometimes these things happen in clusters and you sort of see increases and decreases. And it's always unsettling whenever, you know, you're right, sort of generally the city has actually seen a decrease in crime and violent crime. But, you know, this particular area, though, has seen a bit of an uptick. Not necessarily in overall crime, but in person crime, you know, crimes against people.
Right.
You know, I mean, she also did talk about, you know, this is a big city, and no matter what you do, there's going to be things like this that happen every now and then, unfortunately. So, you know, I think it's going to be a balancing act between investing resources that are going to legitimately make a difference, but also investing, I think some of this is going to be symbolic, frankly, which is putting resources there that simply just make people feel better. And, you know, again, that's
a part of it, too.
You can debate whether or not that's a proper thing to be doing, but I think that it's not a surprising thing to be doing.
No. Certainly we'll be watching what's happening with Lisa Herbold's Public Safety Committee going forward here. I know the mayor is going to be proposing a few things, and we'll see how that committee reacts there. Thanks for breaking that down with me. But David, I wanted to focus on a piece you had very recently about affordable housing. A lot of people applying for this, but not that many spots available. You focused on an area in the Central District, and this was really an interesting thing, this whole neighborhood preference piece they're pushing for. Can you explain where you were looking, what was going on here, what this whole neighborhood preference thing is all about?
Yeah, so this story actually started from my commute. I go by this building that I'd seen under construction, and I knew it was an affordable housing building, and I had seen them put up a for-lease sign, and then like a day or two later, that was gone. So
drive-by journalism.
Right,
okay,
so I figured that it had, like most affordable housing in Seattle, I figured it had gotten a lot of interest. And so I asked them about it, and they'd gotten about 850 applications for 74 spots. And these apartments weren't even necessarily, so the most affordable, these were just for people who might be in jobs like, a teacher or something like that. So they are working professionals, but they're just not making enough to afford to live in Seattle. Which
happens
is
a lot, yeah.
Increasingly common story. But yeah, the unique thing about this is that they are prioritizing about half of those 74 apartments for people who used to live in the neighborhood. So it's a neighborhood preference. And so for half of the people who are going to get this apartment, they're going to have to prove that they lived in the Central District at some point before the year 2000.
With the letters or addresses, how do you do that?
Yeah, I don't know. That's actually a good question. I didn't ask them about that. But I assume something like that, or property records.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
And so, it's interesting because it's sort of the most direct effort we've seen to combat gentrification and displacement in that what was a historically majority black neighborhood, and it is no longer. Right. So I think it's interesting.
It's one of those situations. I know the city council has actually talked about this for a while. Any sort of legal challenges you could foresee from this whole idea of neighborhood preference? Why is that person getting the spot and not me? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say for certain. Not being a lawyer, but
we're a litigious society.
Right.
Yes, I know.
But what they're saying is that they're not discriminating or excluding anybody based on a protected class. So it's not about race. It's not about age. It's simply about location. And because half of the apartments are open lottery.
Yes.
They feel pretty confident that they can do this. Portland has done this. In Northeast Portland, and it's a new thing for Seattle. I would be surprised if anybody sued necessarily over this.
It is interesting to see it build, though. What was just a concept a little while ago, now we're actually going to see people placed. I mean, this is a very physical, we want to avoid gentrification. This is something where you can actually do that. I mean, a very physical way, it sounds like.
Right, and in the past, Seattle has added a lot of affordable housing, and so theoretically that can sort of indirectly help that, but we've never seen new buildings go so directly after people who literally used to live in that neighborhood and now maybe want to come back. Before it was creating new opportunities for people so that they wouldn't be pushed out. But this is interesting that you could have theoretically 30, almost 40 people, 40 families, households move back into the area.
That's a big deal because that discussion about housing and affordable housing is at the center of the homelessness debate, certainly in our area here. As much as you can try to work on social services, etc., you need places for people that are more affordable. I had just heard from a few homelessness advocates that there is a new report from McKinsey just now coming out talking a lot more about this, about, hey, if you need to have more housing for people who are making in between that 0% and 30% of the average median income here, you're going to have to make an investment of $450 million for the next 10 years in a row. I mean, some big numbers we're talking about here. I know this feels like a drop in the bucket, and I don't know if you see it that way, but it seems like if we can make some more investments like this as a city, if Seattle can do that, King County can do that, maybe this is one of those answers they can look at when we look at this holistic picture of homelessness.
Yeah, no, and I think that's true. The tough part of thinking about a project like this, which is targeting, so that these are a 2-bedroom in this building is going to rent for $1,100.
Yeah.
So that's not cheap necessarily, but it is much more affordable than market rate at this point. And so when you look at a place like that, what's sort of hard is, it is sort of a zero-sum game for all these affordable housing developments between city and state and county, and then low-income housing tax credits. These affordable buildings are competing for those same resources as those 0 to 30% median income. And so the problem when you need to start providing affordable housing to people who are working full-time jobs, it makes it harder to really focus on some of that chronic homelessness. And so that kind of, in a nutshell, sums up how you can see rising rents sort of indirectly in some ways directly impact some of the street homelessness that we see.
Yeah, great piece, David. Thanks for breaking that down. All right, we're going to move on to Now Hear This. We're talking about some of the things our local leaders have been working on recently in the past couple weeks here. Councilmember Sawant just held a special meeting on the issue of banning winter evictions. She's trying to do this, ban those evictions from November 1st to March 31st. This is something that would start up next year potentially. Here's what she had to say about it at a recent meeting.
This is a question of humanity. It's a humane law to make sure that people, especially with families, as Nancy Rankin said, the people who are most impacted are women-led families with children. So it's about protecting the most vulnerable people.
All right, David. So Councilmember Sawant has been very active at the start of the new year here, talking about winter evictions specifically with a packed meeting here in terms of talking about what she wants to do with this whole ban on winter evictions here. This seems like something where there's going to be a natural pushback from landlords, whatever else. Break down this issue for me. Is this something that she's going to be able to push through? Do you have any feel for this?
I don't know. I mean, I think you're right that it would certainly face legal challenges. And so, if the goal is to get this in place before some of the worst winter months, I imagine that would sort of would delay it.
Sure.
It's modeled loosely off of some laws in France.
Yes.
I don't know the sort of detailed nuance of what those laws are, but I do understand that there's some difference, some more caveats involved in those French laws.
Right.
And so I don't know. I mean, I think probably what could happen is this conversation will move forward the sort of broader conversation around evictions. And I know that a lot of people would prefer, rather than putting any moratoriums on when you can evict someone, putting more resources towards preventing evictions in the first place.
Yeah.
So
the carrot rather than the stick, I guess, in this case.
Yeah, exactly. There's already a program. I can't remember its exact name, but it's funded in large part by actually the Seattle Mariners and United Way.
Right.
Where basically it's pretty simple. It's a lot of people get evicted for what are pretty small amounts of money, $100, $200, sometimes even less than that. And so these funds are basically, they figure it's cheaper to pay the $200 than it is to deal with what happens, the repercussions of when somebody actually gets evicted. And so I would be a little bit surprised if we actually see an evictions ban in winter months, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if this conversation that, I think to her credit, Councilmember Sawant has started leads to something like that, where maybe they put more resources towards preventing eviction.
Very true, and I think this is really right out of her playbook. She asks for the moon, $15 minimum wage, and then it starts with $12, but a huge move within that space. So I really think that this conversation at the city level, for sure. I know Nicole Macri, one of our local representatives here at the state level, is working on a good cause eviction law there too. So it really feels like trying to, I guess, overall strengthen that kind of renter's bill of rights that Councilmember Sawant's been talking about over the past several years, really.
Right, and and this is, as you sort of pointed out, this is where Councilmember Sawant is genuinely effective and pretty good at what she does, which is she's an organizer. She starts with an idea and says what, sort of builds energy around what is essentially what she would like to see her end goal. And
Builds
I think oftentimes
an
end goal that her colleagues can support, but maybe they don't totally support the means to get there. But because she's built up this momentum around it, there becomes movement in city council. And so, I think it's an interest. It's a tactic that frustrates people, but can actually produce results, even if they're not exactly the results that Councilmember Sawant wanted in the first place.
That's fair. And just moving on a little bit, we touched on this in our podcast a little bit earlier too. Councilmember Sawant is also talking about expanding tiny home villages, having more of them in the city of Seattle, as many as 40 of them, which I don't even know if there are 40 sites that would exist in the city of Seattle for that to happen. But let's talk about this a little bit, because I think there's some urgency to this, because the current ordinance authorizing encampment permits expires at the end of March of this year. So I think Councilmember Swan is trying to craft some legislation. I'm not going to say that's her strong suit in terms of putting those actual pieces of legislation together, but I think in starting this movement, she's gone one direction, and there's been a little pushback already, I think, from the council on this. Are we going to see 40 new tent cities, new encampments around the city? What's your feel on this, David?
Yeah, well, and it wouldn't be tent cities; it would be tiny home villages. Which,
although there's some devil in the details.
Right.
She hasn't done a great job in terms of laying out what's a tent city, what's a tiny home village.
Well, I can say fairly confidently that they would probably not create 40 new tent cities.
Okay.
But whether or not they create space for more tiny home villages, again. Is it going to be 40? And as you mentioned, are there even 40 places to put it? I'm not so sure, but it does sort of create a momentum around this thing that I think that there's genuine, Councilmember Sally Bagshaw, before she left, had always been very vocally in support of tiny home villages. Mm-hmm. So it's not like Sawant is off on her own in supporting these alternatives, which are, fairly unanimously viewed as positive alternatives.
They're effective in terms of getting people into more permanent housing. They have a much higher success rate than any of the other models at work.
Right, and federally they're still seen as technically homeless.
That's right.
So that is sort of a sticking point, which is that you're literally, by definition, not solving the problem by doing it, but you are getting people into situations that are preferable to living, off of Dearborn Street or, in a tent somewhere.
Right, and I think that's the big piece here. The data really shows that the tiny home villages are outperforming the enhanced shelters that the city has in terms of moving people into permanent housing. The tent encampment's really not doing that, so we'll have to see what happens with the details here. But this is going to be heard in Councilmember Lewis's Select Committee on Homelessness. I think this is a big issue for him to tackle right out of the gate. I know he's capable to do it in terms of talking with him, but I'm wondering what that discussion is going to be like. How much Councilmember Swant's going to be in his ear? How much she's going to be guiding that discussion there? Do you have a feel for that I don't know, power structure, I guess, on the council, how this goes forward?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think, it'll be interesting. I mean, because Councilmember Gonzalez, when she's back from parental leave, will sort of have a lot of power in directing where these initiatives, which committees these initiatives go through.
Yeah.
It seems like for now it's in Councilmember Lewis's. Mm-hmm. I don't know that it's his number one priority.
Yeah.
I think his priority is, and probably the priority of the rest of the council, is figuring out how to raise more money to build more affordable housing, not necessarily tiny home. And which isn't to say that they don't support tiny home villages, but you do have a sort of limited capacity and limited political capital. And I think some of the new council members and some of the old council members at this point would probably prefer to spend that capital on figuring out where they're going to raise a fairly significant amount of new money in order to build permanent supportive housing.
Right, and I think that's always the struggle here when we talk about homelessness. There are some short-term solutions, safe parking zones, things like that for people who are car camping essentially overnight. There are places like tiny home villages, there are tent encampments. The idea is to try to meet people wherever you can to make sure they are, quote unquote, off the streets. But off the streets and actually not being homeless, there's a fine line there. But it really feels like this is one of those city efforts where they've got to go down a bunch of different paths to try to meet people where they are, to try to at least get them into this pipeline of services, the way I look at it.
Yeah, and I think also some of it's going to depend on what the legislature does this session.
Right.
Governor Inslee has proposed dipping into the rainy day fund to basically get people off of the streets. The things he's proposing don't appear to be to build new permanent supportive housing. He's just pushing for efforts to get people to reduce the street homelessness. I don't think anybody believes that the legislature has the 60% of votes that it needs to actually dip into the rainy day fund, but something else could come out of that, and then if there's more money towards those sort of temporary, more preventative efforts, then maybe we'd see more momentum on some of the tiny home villages as well.
We will see. Yeah, that's something that's going to be happening fast and furious at the state level as we go through a short session here. Definitely keeping an eye on that. And thanks, David. I'm going to move on to what's next. David, I wanted to touch on a piece that you recently ran in Crosscut with regard to cash assistance for people on welfare. This is a really interesting dynamic that you've been talking about here. You highlighted a local family in talking about this. I don't know exactly how to put this, but essentially the need is still very high, but the amount of cash assistance our state is actually handing out is plummeting. What's going on here?
So after the recession, the legislature needed to cut $8 billion from its budget, and so it was looking all over the place for ways to do that. And so welfare got on the chopping block, and welfare literally can sort of come in a lot of different forms. But the way people most think about it is, monthly cash assistance.
Yeah.
So what the legislature did in 2011 is basically passed a lot of policies that made it much easier to be removed from the program.
Yes.
So you couldn't get extensions on your lifetime limit of 5 years any longer. If you sort of fell out of compliance with the program, the hook was a lot faster. And then a few sort of more, they required people to show up in person for orientations more often. And so all of these things combined, they never literally cut the budget exactly, but what they did is they just made it harder to be on the program. And then therefore the caseloads fell, and so the budget followed. It's an interesting thing because, a lot of states did that, but Washington is one of few states that has not really done very much to restore those cuts. And so, the most stunning statistic to me, I think, was that in 2006, I think 62 out of 100 families in poverty were accessing cash welfare benefits.
Okay.
And now that number is down to 29 out of 100. So it's a massive drop in the need versus the availability of cash welfare assistance.
Wow. And where are these people going? Falling through the cracks, I guess, becoming homeless? What's going on?
I mean, welfare, it's not a lot of money, so it's never been... It's never been necessarily the life-saving hook. You would need to combine it with other resources, and food stamps and things like that. But what it can do is cover sort of basic things like, so these are all families with children. Diapers end up costing a lot of money, formula, things, just things like that. And so, those families just don't have access to that anymore. And it's difficult to find in the data a direct tie between cutting cash assistance and homelessness. You don't. You'd have to ask everybody individually why they're homeless, and that's difficult to do.
Got you.
But if you talk to most people, they suspect that there is some correlation there. And something like a third of the people who are getting kicked off of welfare are being kicked off into homelessness. They are homeless at the time that they lose their benefits, and so it's a fairly stunning decrease from when cash welfare, as we know it now, called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, was passed in 1996. Washington was spending the equivalent of over $300 million of its own money on welfare, and last year it spent $13 million. So it's totally bottomed out. I think there is some momentum in the legislature to change that, at least to restore those requirements for being on the program back to pre-2011 levels.
Sure.
That will cost money. That'll cost, because once you add to the caseload, you have to spend more. And so it's probably going to add another something like $30 million a year to its budget in order to do that. But I think we could see some bipartisan motion towards that.
We'll see what happens there, because I know on a national level, President Trump is talking about trying to streamline the welfare system too, when he's not talking about impeachment or whatever else. So, all right, need to wrap up here. David Kroman has an excellent Twitter feed. If you're not following it, you need to. Kroman David, not only talking about the pieces he does for Crosscut, but all sorts of things, including one that I thought was fascinating, David. You did a tiny bit of research, I believe, on this one, but the Baseball Writers Hall of Fame came out with their votes. Derek Jeter's getting in on that first ballot. Larry Walker, glad Superman's in there after his 10th year. But we're talking about some votes here. Who is voting for these different? You got those one vote on the ballot. I thought you made a great observation about one of the last names on the ballot.
Yeah, J.J. Putz. He was like
go M's.
Yeah, he was a pretty good closer for the Mariners for a couple of years. I mean, he was legitimately good. I think for like 2 years. I don't remember what happened to him after he left the Mariners, but pretty good for 2 years is not Hall of Fame worthy. So I would be very curious to know who voted for J.J. Putz. Yeah. I don't know if his mom's a baseball writer. That would be very interesting to know. We had J.J. Putz with one vote.
Raul Ibanez. Come on, give him
Yeah.
more than one vote. I loved that guy.
He was legitimately very good also. But,
Yeah.
I don't think he put up Hall of Fame numbers.
Yeah,
I think he had
yeah.
a few good All-Star years.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
about it.
Cliff Lee, I'm not sure if that one's going to go anywhere either.
Yeah.
Again, not long enough of a
I
career.
think at
guess.
his best, Cliff Lee could possibly be a Hall of Fame pitcher, but
Yeah.
I think at his best was only maybe a couple years.
Okay.
But, again,
We'll have to see. All right,
Yeah.
all the observations you want and more. Thank you very much, David, for pinch hitting this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews.
yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, great. Next time you want to know what's brewing in local politics, make sure you give us a listen. You can reach us via email at seattlenewsviewsandbrews@gmail.com. Subscribe on iTunes or Spotify, and thanks so much for listening.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.